The reading this week is on sustainability. It's this article by two British guys who are really, I think, taking a very refreshing look at sustainability. They're looking, in the biggest sense, what is sustainability? That word gets bandied about and thrown around all the time, but and sometimes some people mean one thing about it and some people mean something very different. So they're saying, well, let's look at the biggest umbrella of what does sustainability mean. And they then separate it out into what they call 6 competing logics. Very interesting to call it that. The notion that maybe they're competing, that it isn't that these things are all consistent and it's one very consistent package. Sometimes you might do one thing that's very sustainable in a certain regard, and it actually is not sustainable in another regard. And I like the fact that they understand the complexity, really, of what is this notion of being good to the earth, being sustainable in the long run. So we're going to talk about half of that article this week, and we're going to talk about the other half of that article in class next week. So this week we'll look at 3 of those competing logics. In this talk, we're going to look at ecocentric, and in the next talk, we're going to look at ecotechnic and ecoaesthetic, the first 3 of those things that the article presents. So we'll see, I think really the goal here is for everybody to figure out, where does my heart lie? What aspects of sustainability seem particularly important to me? And I think this is a good way to thrash that out. So in this talk, we're going to concentrate on this notion of ecocentric. And my experience is that when most students read this, ecocentric is what they're the least interested in. They kind of don't get it, they don't see the importance of it necessarily, or they just downright hate the whole idea. So I'm prepared. You guys may believe in this, you may not believe in this, but I think it's a valid point that they make. So this ecocentric assumes that nature is fragile. We live on a globe that is vulnerable, and that building is in some ways a violent and destructive thing, that it disrupts the ecosystem. It's difficult for nature to live compatibly with human construction and building, and that there may be a mission of architecture of non-interference or of reduction of its interference with nature. And it's a kind of radical idea to reduce the ecological footprint of architecture and of buildings in the world in order to make it a more sustainable place. Whoa, dude, that's hard for us architects to take. You mean what I do, this is destructive to the ecosystem, and the more I do it, the more destructive it is? It's a kind of base assumption that is hard for architects to swallow. But there's a real sense to it. I mean, all you have to do is look at the sprawl around many cities, maybe especially cities in very beautiful and very delicate ecosystems, and see this mass destruction that is happening, to begin to say, wait, maybe we need to think about how can we reduce our ecological interference with the natural environment by the amount that we build and the way that we build. So I would say there are 4 ways that this can happen. The first thing is, honestly, we could just build less. You know, it's a weird thing. In the United States, in the 1950s, the average size of an American home was 1,000 square feet. And the average number of people in that home was 3.5 people. Currently, the average size of the American home is a little over 2,500 square feet, 2.5 times as much, and the average household is about 2.2 people. So the households have shrunk and the houses have grown enormously. Is that really necessary for centuries? People lived in much, much less space than we do today. So one way to reduce the ecological footprint of architecture would be to say, maybe we build less big houses. And that would be one way to accomplish that. Can you see yourself as an architect going to a wealthy client? Maybe it's just a couple, they're retired, their kids are grown. They come to you and they say, oh my God, we've been dreaming of building this fantastic house. We think we want about, 14,000 square feet. We want a music room, we want a playroom, we want a media room, we want a dining room, we want a eat-in kitchen. We have all these things we want in our dream house. 14,000 square feet for 2 human beings? Would it be responsible for you as an architect to go to them and say, can we do it in 10,000? Can we do it in 8,000? And that would not only reduce the amount of land consumed, the amount of building resources consumed, but also for the life of that house. That means you would be heating and air conditioning only 8,000 square feet instead of 14,000 square feet. You would almost halve your energy consumption in that house. So yes, there's a huge ecological footprint that can be reduced simply by thinking, do we really need as much space as we sometimes think we do? Another thing in terms of just building less would be to do more adaptive reuse. Reuse the buildings we already have built rather than always building a new building. Or recycling is certainly another way of building less, having less ecological footprint by the materials we're consuming and the activity of building. So the first thing is it possible that we could think of doing the same job, having the building accomplish the same goals, but building less building? Another approach to ecocentric would be to maybe build a bit more compactly. So in the United States especially, we've just felt like there's an infinite supply of land. Huge uninhabited portions of the country, most cities surrounded by countryside and landscape. That seems so available. Why can't we just build more and build more and build more and just sprawl out into that natural ecology? And that's been the policy of most cities. There are very, very few cities who actually restrain their borders in that way. There is a wonderful example of it in Adelaide in Australia, where they defined the limits of the city and then they purchased parkland all the way around that. And all of that is going to be protected, so that it encouraged the city to have a limit and to build compactly within that limit and then return to nature immediately on the other side of that. The benefit of that is everyone in the city has close proximity to beautiful, ecologically pure natural environment. Another big benefit is, of course, that you're not sprawling into and consuming all of that additional land. So could we build more densely and more compactly and consume less land? Another thing that would be related to this would be simply to use less footprint for any kind of building, and in that way have fewer roads, fewer freeways, less sewer lines, less electrical lines, less storm sewer lines, all of those things that consume in the infrastructure by having a much more compact infrastructure for the city. So we could build less, we could perhaps build more compactly. A third thing we could do to be more ecocentric would be to build with renewable or natural materials, and maybe materials that are not consumed but are able to be renewed very easily. And there's a lot of interest in this in architecture, of looking at the ecological footprint of every material we use. And certainly you can think of the difference between a farmed wood and wood that's coming out of the rainforest in Brazil, and that one has a big ecological impact in that delicate ecosystem of the rainforest of South America. And the other one is actually, it's a farmed product, is easily recycled, renewed, and you can build generations of it without consuming any more land. So that's one way you could think of that. Another way is to just think of the amount of embodied energy in any given material. The difference between a steel frame and a concrete frame of a building is a significant difference in consumption of resources and even energy to produce those two different things. The same thing is true of any building material. And sometimes it's very surprising what, in fact, are the most economical in terms of their consumption of resources, what are the most economical materials for building. But to think of that as we're specifying, is that a steel frame, is that a concrete frame? Steel can be recycled, concrete is not normally recycled. So is it recyclable? All of these things would be part of that ecocentric mindset of always looking at making the least impact when you're building. The fourth point I want to make here is that there can be a whole idea of less consumption, of less footprint, that can be inspiring, that can actually be incredibly interesting in terms of design. The example I always love to use is in Tokugawa, Japan. So Japanese culture for centuries had been a kind of feudal system where they had daimyos, or kind of warlords that were over little small regions, and the whole archipelago of Japan was full of these little warring daimyos, and they were all killing each other and having all these massive alliances and then destructive wars. And so that went on for centuries, and in that period of time, the population was pretty flat in Japan. They were killing each other in wars. And it was not a period of great growth of the economy there. And then the Tokugawa period came along, and they began to have this system of a shogun. And the shogun was kind of the king daimyo, the lord of the warlords. And he began to coordinate all of those warlords and to kind of keep the peace among them. And that began the Tokugawa period in Japan. This is in the 19th century. And for a period of, 80 or 100 years, there was tremendous affluence in Japan. They stopped fighting each other. They started, having population growth. Instead of spending all their time with wars, they spent their time with sophisticated agriculture and other kinds of things that were beginning to be much more productive. So it's a period of great affluence in Japanese culture. And architecture went along with it. And all of these daimyos, instead of having a war to show how great they were, they built a badass castle, a really knock you on your ass kind of castle. And there's still many of them in Japan. They're gorgeous, and they're made of these, because they built largely in wood in Japan, because there's so much wood, it basically is completely forested there. And so they're felling these huge trees, and they're making massive heavy timber frames for these badass castles. And everyone's trying to upstage everybody else. And then their cities also are being made of wood. So the hoi polloi, everybody's building out of wood. And when they build cities out of wood, sometimes there's a fire, and the fire comes through and it burns down the whole part of the city. And the solution to that generally was, well, we'll just rebuild it again. And so they go out and fell more trees. Seemed to be an infinite supply of forests out there, and they'd rebuild the city. So they're consuming wood like crazy. The population's growing. They're very affluent. They're building these badass castles. They're also building these cities out of wood, and then they've burned down and they have to rebuild them. Huge consumption of wood. And finally, there was a big fire in Edo, which is what is now Tokyo, the capital of Japan. And in this big fire, there was huge destruction, and there was a lot of rebuilding to be done. And when they went out to the forest to try to do that, they realized, oh, damn, we're running out of wood, and our timber supply is not infinite. So they began to have a completely different attitude about building and about resources. And now the shogun was there to institute these kind of top-down measures, and they began silviculture, which is farming forest, farming wood, and they got very scientific about what species of tree was best for this kind of building, what species of tree was best for that kind of building, what species of tree was better for firewood. You know, they figured all that out. They then rationed all of those building materials. So if you were at this particular position in society, you got X number of units of wood. And if you were at this position, you got Y units of wood. And that's all you had to build with. So the architects had to get much more clever. You couldn't just build as if there were an infinite supply of wood. You had to think, how can I make the most out of this limited amount of wood? And it made the architects really creative. There was this burst of invention and creativity that came from that restriction. So they couldn't use heavy timbers. They had to begin to use really small timbers and maximize their structural role. They began to make the partitions inside the house out of shoji screens because shoji is actually wood. It's made out of paper, which is made out of wood, but it's very, very little use of wood for kind of maximum benefit of partitioning the house. They began to make even the exterior walls much lighter and thinner and often open to porches that then were open to gardens. They began to use much more indoor-outdoor connection in the buildings because they couldn't afford to build these thick walls like they had been doing before. So that provocation really impacted the way they designed in a macro sense. And out of that came what we think of as beautiful traditional Japanese architecture. These buildings with light, thin, optimally sized wood frames, infill that is shoji screens or very, very lightweight wood construction, lots of interconnectivity between indoor and outdoor, lots of interconnectivity between the rooms on the inside because of limited capacity for using more materials. And in the end, it made a beautiful architecture, a kind of architecture that then inspired people like Frank Lloyd Wright or Mies van der Rohe or many of the modern masters, very impressed with this beautiful, light, delicate kind of architecture that had been produced in Japan. But all of that was done with an ecocentric mindset. How can we have a smaller ecological footprint? How can we use less, consume less, and make some magic out of that rather than feeling oppressed by that restriction, instead feeling inspired by that restriction? So is it possible that we could think of an architecture that used less, had a smaller ecological footprint, but was inventive and new and amazing? So think about it. We'll talk about it in class.